Welcome back to the show, credit union community. Here's what we're covering today. First, 70% of credit union employees are women, but research shows women are 41% more likely to experience toxic workplace culture. Next up, a credit union CEO allegedly told a merger partner, "I run a dictatorship and I am the dictator." The merger collapsed, now they're in court. And finally, a single conference can cost a credit union $20,000. But is your team coming back with real skills or just inspiration and a vendor tote bag? Welcome to Grow Your Credit Union, the podcast where credit union leaders gather, learn, and grow. I am your host, Joshua Barkley. If there's a topic you want us to cover on the show, go to info@growyourcreditunion.com and tell us. Or you can message me on LinkedIn. My co-host today is the talk of Texas, Becky Reed. Hello, Becky.
Howdy, y'all.
Okay, Becky, we got to do our banter segment. And for everybody listening, earlier today, we recorded another show. I asked Becky about a grandma story. She told me an interesting story about how she walked in on her grandmother doing yoga naked. Now, I'm not going to beat up a dead horse here, Becky, but tell me now, while we're on this discussion of wild stories, do you have anything else for me that is highly bizarre like that?
Well, I'm sure I could come up with something. I mean, look, I already told you about how I rode my horse to Dairy Queen, right? So we talked about that. Talking about my grandma story with, she was a very holistic and vitamins and yoga before that was even a cool thing, right? And I suppose I could talk about how when I was a child, I loved to explore, right? We lived in the country, so I loved to explore. And so one of the interesting, this is going to be terrible. I can't believe I want to tell this. So we had lived on a couple acres. We had animals, right? We had cows and horses and goats and stuff. And of course, the neighborhood dogs, there would be a pack of them. They would just be running around and they would just go from house to house. Well, as you can imagine, living in the country, the dogs would get ticks, right? They would have ticks. And so I love to take the bloated, ticks and put them on an ant pile and just see what happened.
Becky, I feel like you and me are breaking new ground with our comfort level. First, it's naked yoga grandma. Now I don't know if we want to call this tick torture. I don't think anyone's going to feel bad.
Can you even torture a tick? I mean, they're vile creatures.
Well, Lyme disease is big where I'm from in Connecticut. So I know people whose lives have been ruined by ticks. So I don't think anybody's going to call you and say, hey, I think it's insensitive what you said about what you did to those ticks. So I'll let that one pass. I feel like we know each other better, which is always good.
Be careful what you ask for, Josh.
Yeah, next time I'll think a little bit more closely about what it is that I ask you. Let's get into today's show, Becky, because today's guest has been on the show previously. We welcome back the Chief Experience Officer at Amplify Credit Union, Stacey Armijo. Nice to see you again, Stacey.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here.
Credit unions pride themselves on the people helping people philosophy, but are we living that internally in our workplace culture? MIT Sloan Research analyzed 600,000 workplace reviews and found women are 41% more likely to experience toxic workplace culture. And they also found that toxic culture is 10 times more powerful than compensation in predicting turnover. Here's why I think this is very interesting, Stacey, because Filene Research Institute found that 70% of credit union employees are women. So if credit unions aren't actively building cultures where women feel empowered, then I think they're undermining their own talent foundation going into the future. So what I'm thinking here, Stacey, when you look at credit union culture specifically, what are the toxic, let's say, patterns that women disproportionately face? And what do executives often miss when they're happening?
Okay, so I have a couple thoughts on this. My first thought on this is one, I'm so glad we're talking about it because that's absolutely true. Two, when you think about one of our philosophies at Amplify is always your culture internally is your culture externally. And so many organizations that I know, and credit unions in particular, they sort of talk about what is our service culture? What is our member oriented culture? And they talk about that as if it exists in that vacuum without acknowledging what is our corporate culture? What is our organizational culture? Because organizations, they only have one. You can't put a quote unquote nice face to your member when actually the way that your employees treat one another is disrespectful and is toxic. And that is going to come out in terms of who you interact with. So the first thing I think is not only are a disproportionate number of credit unions employees female, what is the gender breakdown of the people that you serve as a credit union? I'm going to guess it is not predominantly male. It is probably at the very least roughly half and half, if not more so leaning female. So not only is it the right thing to do to think about how can I have an organizational culture that is positive and that inspires the best from the people that work with me, but also I am going to be more successful in terms of what I'm trying to do for my member, or we interchange member and customer at Amplify, because that is how I'm going to resonate with them best. And the first thing that I think about is there are no different rules for men or women in the workplace, but there can be different experiences about what makes somebody feel welcome. And that's how we talk about it at Amplify. We talk about, we have a culture of welcome. That means everyone is welcome here. And we have practices that make sure everybody feels like they're welcome here. We do proactive training around it. Our Senior Vice President of Talent, Angela Shaw, is an absolute champion of it. But not just her. Our CEO talks about culture of welcome all the time. He and I do new employee orientation together. We do culture conversations together. We spend a lot of time on things like culture, and that is with intention. And it is because we think it is not only good for the employees and for what we're experiencing, but it's good for the business. I don't think that is an accident then. If you look even at our technical teams, look at places within your credit union where you would more typically lean female or male. We were on a call 2 days ago, and the technology partner said, "Oh, wow, it's unusual that I have a screen full of females," because they're not used to that, because most of our tech team, our chief information officer happens to be a woman, every VP over our project management and product management, the teams below them. And so I don't think it's an accident that we have people in decision-making positions that help to structure that. If you compare that to other credit unions, I wonder what that would look like and what opportunities is somebody missing based on that.
You said something that I want to pass this over to you, Becky, but Stacey, you said different cultures of welcome. And I really, really like that, because my culture of welcome, what might make me feel comfortable and welcome might also make another person feel like, ooh, this person's a freaking jerk. And I feel alienated and I feel... So Becky, when we think about the different cultures of welcome, I want to revisit the MIT Sloan research saying that women are more likely to experience this sort of toxic culture. What are your thoughts on that, Becky?
Well, where my head immediately went was experience. Stacey mentioned it, but women and men experience the world through different lenses because we're different people. You know, the saying, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. We experience things differently. And so when I heard that from the study, I kind of went, okay, is that because women are perceiving things differently, maybe, than men, and what they consider toxic? Are more women being together more toxic than a 50-50 split, that includes both genders? Or what is that? So I'm curious about that. But what I can say is that, anyone who is in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex knows that there are communication differences and challenges. And certainly when you're in a work environment, even people of the same gender have different life experiences that cause them to perceive things through a different lens. So I think that from a culture perspective, what Stacey talked about, you have got to have multiple ways you exemplify your culture and do it all the time. So you said your culture of welcome might be different, Josh, than Stacy's or mine. But what I may provide as a welcome might resonate with some and maybe not others. But at the end of the day, it's all welcome. And I think that right there is that diversity statement, right? The importance of culture and welcoming and openness and, all of those things. I think too, we've talked about this on the show before, that mental health is certainly something that we're allowed to talk about more, over the last decade or so. It's been something that we have started incorporating into our corporate vernacular, things like burnout, depression, things that are happening outside of the workplace that we bring in that cause us stress and can cause us to treat other people differently, right? Because a lot of times how we treat others is a reflection of how we're feeling internally. So all that to say that I think women tend to experience things from a feeling and emotional perspective. So I'm not surprised that the study found that women experience toxicity more so than a man might respond in a survey question about, because women do internalize those things and are much more emotional about them. And I'm speaking generalities, of course, than most men. And so, a man might not think being blunt is toxic, where a woman may feel like being blunt means they're not being heard. So, there's nuance there, of course, but I really take into consideration the feelings of the people who responded to that survey.
There's so much to unpack here, and I'll close out with you, Stacy. The way you tackled this question was interesting because you didn't really make it a male-female thing. You said it's a culture thing. Everybody's involved. It's everybody's culture of welcome. But if you had to speak on your sense of why you think, and this is completely based on opinion and gut and not data, but your opinion and your feelings as a woman who's came up in the workplace to a very high stature, why do you think women would find the workplace more toxic than, let's say, men?
So I've had a different experience than the one that Becky has had. Whereas when it comes to gender, I find men and women tend to bring the same amount of emotion to their decisions, but some people understand when they're experiencing emotion and some people don't. And they attribute the emotion they're experiencing to the quality and passion and importance of what they're saying versus that being an emotional reaction. And so I don't see that breakdown in gender lines in my experience. But what I do know is if you have that level of awareness, and then you can have a more fact-based conversation, that can be helpful. However, I have gotten really good at saying what I mean in a way that can be heard. And so by that, what I mean is, I know how to phrase things in a way that doesn't get somebody else's back up. I can say something difficult without inspiring a level of defensiveness. That is a skill I've honed over decades. I've never heard a man describe how they have had to adapt the way that they communicate so that they don't inspire defensiveness in the person that they're talking to. I have never interacted with a female executive who doesn't immediately know what I'm talking about when I say that. And so that's how I would probably characterize the difference. Another just brief example is I was talking to a friend of mine. He's very experienced, a person of a lot of wherewithal and influence in Texas politics, in fact. And I said, oh yeah, when you're around somebody and you get the ick, you know how that feeling is? And he said, no, what do you mean? And I was like, oh, every woman I've ever known knows exactly what I mean when I say you're in that networking environment and you get the ick. Every woman I know knows what that means. And she finds a safe way out of that particular situation. No man I've ever known has shown up to a random networking situation and found themselves in a situation where they were worried all of a sudden their physical safety or their reputation might be at risk and they have to exit. That's never happened to a man that I know. So those are examples of things that I think are different.
I run a dictatorship and I am the dictator. I do not care what you say or what you think. No, this is not something I've said to my producer, Andrew. This is actually a quote from California Coast Credit Union CEO Todd Lane This is what he allegedly, I'm using air quotes for allegedly, it was what he allegedly told San Diego County Credit Union's chief risk officer during merger integration planning. The two credit unions were in the process of combining into a $12.6 billion institution. The merger has since collapsed. The credit unions are now in court. And this case highlights a very interesting question for me about credit union leadership culture. Stacy, in your opinion, when credit unions are evaluating merger partners, how would you actually assess whether an executive team has the leadership character to run a combined institution?
I think the first thing I would want to know is, where did the conversation start? And here's what I mean by that. We've been involved in lots of conversations about potential mergers and things, and we are definitely open to that. We believe scale is going to win the race, and we credit unions better get real about getting some real scale if we're going to win the customer of the future. I am pro merger. I'll just start there. Also, I find it fascinating. Every conversation that I've ever been a part of or aware of starts from, here's what our combined balance sheet would look like. Look how big of a credit union we would be. And now let's talk about the way our loan products overlap or don't overlap. And it all starts from this, here's what a financially combined entity would look like, and wouldn't that be great? That is the last conversation I believe credit unions should have if they want to merge. That is the result, not the purpose. The purpose has to start from, why are you in business? What is it that you do better than anybody else? If you succeed at whatever your financial strategy is, what will become true? And how do you communicate that to your people? And how do you communicate that with your board? All of those things are what most CEOs would call squishy. Oh yeah, that's what the HR people work on, and that's in that's in a PowerPoint somewhere. They couldn't tell you what their core values are. And so I think the biggest issue, if you want to really surface what's going to actually make a merger work, it doesn't have anything to do with the numbers on the page. It has to do with, do the leaders of both of those credit unions in general see the world the same way? They're never going to see the world exactly the same way, right? But do we have enough of a Venn diagram of overlap about the way that we think about why we do what we do and the philosophies that guide what we do? Then let's have a conversation about products and business results and all those things.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I do feel like the industry looks at the combined asset totals and they're like, ooh, we would look so big and strong out there if we combine forces. Yet you're missing the point of, like, if I do partner with them, am I going to get a guy telling me he's a dictator? You know, what do I do in that particular situation? Becky, what are your thoughts on this story in general?
One of the first things I think about, of course, is taking a statement like that out of the context in which it was spoken. Out of context, you take two sentences that sound, frankly, evil, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I would never work with somebody who's a dictator. However, for all we know, the 30 minutes of conversation prior to that were, around organizational structure and in a jovial manner, it was spouted out. Well, I'm a dictator. Look, I call myself bossy. Okay. I'm a bossy person. I like to be in charge and I like to tell people what to do. Now, you can take that one phrase I just said, I like to tell people what to do, and you can take that out of context and make that mean whatever you want to mean and spin it whatever way you want to spin it. All that said, we weren't in the room where those words were uttered. However, what we do know the outcome was that it didn't end up working, right? So at some point, there was a difference of leadership style that was not congruent, right? So I think that, to Stacy's point, it's not just the leadership team. It's also the board that kind of has to see the same, if you're merging because a lot of times some board members will come on to the new board, some number that gets negotiated in the process. And if you have a board that has a completely different, because there's a culture for the board too, right? For what they find acceptable, how they normally run their business, even to the point of what the board packet looks like, right? What they're expecting, the data that they're expecting to see from the leadership team. Who's in the board meetings, right? Is it just the CEO or are other executives invited to the board meeting? So all of those things from a cultural perspective, I think have to be worked out. The devil's in the details. I mean, it is. Yes, you can look at the financials. You can look at the, geographical implications of, a larger footprint and that kind of thing. But really, it's not just the people at the top who it impacts. It's the tellers. It's the call center people. And ultimately, it's your members. So having a people-first approach to merging, I think, is important.
Context does matter, I would say, Becky, like if he said it jokingly, but I think those kind of words, like, it's hard to take those. I like if we're joking, like, ha ha ha, like you hear like laughter at the end of that quote. Okay, like, I guess, but that feels a little like, I don't even know in what context I'm joking about that. But I do like that you did provide that angle because you are right. Context does matter. And I think it is interesting. I would be embarrassed to be this particular guy having that quote aired across to all of the industry publications, having guys like me bring it up on this podcast. So I do think you're right. In the court of law, he probably should be able to defend himself a little bit. But let's close out this segment because we're a little over time. I want to close out with you, Stacey. If you were in the room with someone that said something like that to you, how would you play that?
I would say, it sounds like we're not the right partners for each other, and let's figure out the most effective way to unwind the conversations we've been having. Well, and here's why I would say it that way is, one, life is too short to spend it around anything other than people who have the right perspective in mind and that we have a shared vision for what is the impact that we're trying to create. We have a series of service standards, and there are 6 of them, and one of them is attitude is everything. And the reason that that is one of our service standards is because we all spend way too many of our waking hours at work to spend it in environments where there is territorialism or toxic behavior or disrespect or any of those things. So that's a showstopper for me personally, but also that is a commitment we have made to our employees. So we do trainings for everybody around those things. We talk about all of those as our expectations. And so if I were the one who were sitting in the seat to say, this is going to go or it's not going to go, I've made a commitment to my employees about what they can expect in their environment. And that would not uphold that commitment. So that would be a deal breaker.
Sending a team to a major credit union conference, I mean, you all know it can cost $10,000, $20,000. I mean, depending on how many people you send, how many dinners you go to, etc. But my question here for this segment is, are credit unions getting upskilled at these particular events, or is this just like expensive inspiration? So I did see an interesting article from Cindy Parker. She's the director of conferences and events at Defense Credit Union Council. And she wrote in CU Today about something she calls CU Unplugged. It's a new event where attendees become the speakers and shape the agenda rather than passively consuming content from vendors and consultants. I thought that was an interesting story. But what I want to start this segment off with, Stacey, when you look at the traditional credit union conference circuit, the big trade shows, the expensive keynotes, the vendor-heavy agendas, how do you evaluate whether or not your team is actually getting value?
It doesn't have anything to do with any of those things you just described, which I think is pretty telling. I would say, how do we decide? We decide, did you come back with relationships that are useful to us? Yeah. So whatever it is that's happening on the stage, whether you're in a breakout session or a keynote and whatnot, did it draw together people who have similar problems with people who have similar tech stacks? So this kind of shows where I sit in our organization, but so much of what we can or can't do is dictated by what our tech stack looks like. And so I'm always interested in, did you go to a place where you found other credit unions or community banks that have a tech stack similar enough to ours that what they're doing is something we could practically deploy over the course of a year or two? And what did you learn from them? And are they now a person you know well enough where you could pop them a text message or an email when you say, hey, can you tell me more about this or do more about that? So our objective is not about gathering information we couldn't have gotten from a webinar. It is about who else is in the room with you. And did you have interaction and conversation with them so you went home with something important? That takes equipping our own staff for that. So what we can't do, if that's our objective, we can't go sit in a chair, listen to a keynote, get up and go to another place and not talk to other people and not ask them questions. And not everybody is as outgoing as Stacy is that is going to ask a bunch of questions. So sometimes we have to do a little work with our team of like, oh, you're going to go to that big event. Here's what we expect. And do you have any questions, about how we can help you do that? So we take a little accountability for that as well. But I love the idea of different formats and approaches. Back in the early 2000s, we used to call them bar camps. I don't know if you guys remember that you'd show up to a tech thing and there'd be somebody with a whiteboard and people would be shouting out from the room and you'd put that down and then we would decide what conversation we were having based on that. More recently, I've heard them called reverse keynotes. You have a keynote speaker, but they are not actually a speaker. They are a facilitator. And their job is to surface all the conversations in the room. I love that because my point of view is people gain value from an interaction equivalent to the extent they got to contribute to that interaction. So the amount of time I spent sitting, listening, and nodding my head, I am not gaining near as much value as if I had an opportunity to actually be a participant and either not just ask questions, but offer my perspective. I'm going to walk away from that experience feeling like it was more valuable to me. So those formats seem like a better fit.
You said something that I think is going to go on my wall, which is basically you said, if I could get this at a webinar, then I'm not going. So it's like that should be your rubric. Like if I could chat GPT this, or I could get this from a webinar, then why am I attending this event in the first place? Becky, when you're thinking about these credit union events, when you're thinking about getting value from these conferences, how do you look at these are 10 conferences I could potentially go to, but this is the one I have to go to?
So a couple things from, if you think it's expensive for a credit union to go to a conference, try being a vendor. It is astronomically expensive to get a booth and have it manned by 2 people. I mean, it's really expensive to the point of almost ridiculousness in some cases. And being able to measure the value you get out of it is hard. Credit unions move very slow. I don't know anybody who talks to a credit union at a conference and gets a deal signed that week. It doesn't happen. So it's hard to figure out the ROI from that. But what Stacy said is absolutely accurate. It's the networking, right? It's can I call a friend whenever I get back to my credit union that has the same core, that has the same digital banking, might be experiencing the same problems that I am. And that really lends to the collaborative nature of our industry. Now, I've been to banking conferences before, and bankers absolutely talk about those things just like we do. It's just that some of the sharing that happens between credit unions is just a little less navigable from a bank perspective because, they don't want to share their IP and that kind of thing. Whereas credit unions are like, I use our policies. It doesn't matter. Go ahead. But I think I have seen a shift, me personally. So this DCUC, which I think is genius, by the way, is a great example. One thing that Ann Legg and I did at a conference a couple of years ago is we actually had like a 2-hour workshop session where at the end of the set, we were facilitators like Stacy talked about. At the end of the session, those credit union leaders came away with a roadmap that they could take. It was a data roadmap that they could take back to their credit union and say, here's something we came up with as a group that we might be able to use as a foundation for what we're doing here at the credit union. Other things that have happened there are at Bank Social, we've created a thing called The Collective. I know that there is another organization that's created something called CoLab. I think that was Filene. And it's all about bringing smaller groups together to work together to solve problems. And from a vendor perspective, having credit unions in the room assist with product development, oh my gosh, that's invaluable. You can't even put a value on that. Now, from a credit union perspective, being able to have input on how something is built is equally as valuable. And so I think, I'm a futurist, right? I'm thinking about the future. I'm looking at trends that are happening. I think we're going to start moving from these big giant conferences with 5,000 people and 200 vendors to smaller work groups where people just come together for 2 or 3 days to look at a particular problem, provide input, learn from each other, and create relationships. So I think that the unconference is going to be the new conference.
That brings us to the end of the show. Stacy, this is the part where we ask our guests about final thoughts or plugs.
My final thought, focus on who is making decisions in your organization and whether or not that reflects the customer that you want to appeal to. So we talked about a number of things of the way that people gather, as well as the experiences that women have in the workplace and others. I think it always comes down to who are in the positions of influence in your organization. Do they have the lived experience of the people that you want your products and services to connect to? If they do, you're going to be much more competitive. You're going to be much more effective. If they don't, maybe think about how you can get them there.
And if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what is the best way to do that, Stacy?
LinkedIn, at Stacy-Armijo on LinkedIn.
Becky, final thoughts?
I really loved what Stacy said earlier about emotional intelligence, situational awareness, and communication styles that can disarm defensiveness. I learned some of those things a long time ago, and I notice it in myself sometimes. When I start getting a defensive reaction, I'm like, what just triggered me, right? What just happened there? What about what somebody said to me just triggered defensive-ness all of a sudden? And I think that it's really important for leaders of all genders, all ages, all, the spectrum of everything, of all of our experiences, to be emotionally aware. Because once somebody's wall goes up, it's really, really hard to have a good conversation where both parties feel like they walked away with something valuable and even a common understanding. I mean, when I get defensive, I don't hear anything. and then I walk away and I'm just mad. And, the next day I can't even remember what was decided because it was flooded with my anger or whatever the situation was. So emotional awareness, situational awareness is very, very important for leadership in this day and age.
Becky, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
LinkedIn, baby.
LinkedIn, baby. I want to thank Stacy. Want to thank you, Becky Reed, for being the best co-host in the world. And I want to give a special thanks to you, our listeners, for continuing to support and listen to another episode of Grow Your Credit Union. If you like the show, please follow us on your podcast player of choice. If you want to be a guest or would like to talk about sponsorship opportunities, head to growyourcreditunion.com to learn more. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.